Hi everyone. This is a new series I'm starting where I'm just sharing ideas I find interesting and hopefully you do too. Today we're talking about whether or not consciousness itself has causality, so you might think of this as a framing of the question of whether or not we have free will. Please let me know if there's anything I can do better, if there's any topic you'd like me to cover in another video in this series. Let's get into it. Does subjectivity, or what people typically call consciousness, have causal power? In other words, does it act like a force? I think so. The reason I think this is because we'd all agree my brain is in control of my mouth, and my brain is definitely an objective thing. But I'm talking about consciousness. I'm talking about a subjective experience. So we've got this objective thing, my brain, making an objective reference, what I'm speaking about, to something that's typically considered entirely subjective. If the subjective aspect of my experience had no causal efficacy over how my mouth moved, how could it describe an entire philosophical and hopefully soon more scientific area of interest if consciousness itself had no objectively causal role and was entirely subjective? I wouldn't be able to talk about it. How could it be something we even allude to if it didn't manifest as a kind of causality? And this is something actually evolution seems to harness as well. I mean, we go towards pleasurable things, we avoid painful things, and it seems like that actually plays a sort of a role in natural selection beyond just passive subjective qualia that's assigned to noxious or positive experiences. It actually seems to be a kind of high-dimensional guide that changes the causal envelope of a given system in a way that we have yet to model. It changes the state of the world, how causality plays out, just like magnetism or gravity, but it likely exerts its changes in ways that would be considered complex by the standards of the other fundamental forces. In other words, you probably have to take into consideration a good degree of information theory to understand what leads to the manifestation of conscious states and to what degree those conscious states have causal efficacy and in what way they do. I certainly can't argue how much causal power consciousness itself has. All I can do is say that it has at least some. So subjectivity has altered the course of events in my brain such that I'm now able to speak about it in a form that's being measured by this microphone that I'm speaking into, that's being recorded to a disk on my computer, which I will then upload to the internet, which you'll listen to through your phone or computer, hear through a speaker, and then enter your own subjective space, whose causal envelope will now have been altered to include whatever causality was exerted upon it by this recording. So in other words, there have been neuroplastic changes made to the structure of your brain by consciousness itself, because otherwise those circuits to describe it wouldn't exist. The circuitry that represents the concept of consciousness couldn't have been imprinted onto something objective like my brain without it having causal efficacy. To use machine learning terms, where does the embedding come from? Because there is clearly like a concept of consciousness that we talk about, and even if you look inside a large language model, you're going to find that the embedding for the idea of consciousness is distinct. Now, of course, an LLM is not going to be understanding the significance of the word in a way a human would, because a human has intuitive experiences as a result of being conscious, and therefore will be able to fill in the gaps about what consciousness means in terms of how they behave, because it's not learned. Kind of like how somebody with antisocial personality disorder will often have little gaps in how they approach the world from an outwardly emotional perspective, because the way they present themselves is entirely learned. So when something novel happens to them, they don't know how to respond intuitively in a way that somebody with natural emotion would, because people with normal emotional lives are just reacting to what's being presented to them by lower level emotional brain regions, and can then tell you about them because they integrate that information into higher level regions that then eventually get that data over to the phonological loop in one way or another.
As opposed to drawing on knowledge of observations of how others react in similar circumstances. So an autoregressive large language model's representation of the word consciousness certainly isn't going to be the same as ours, although it might be similar in some aspects. The embedding a large language model learns comes from just a large corpus of text, so it's not like it's going to be possessing the same level of richness that the embedding that we have does, because ours comes from an intuition or a sense, maybe, in other words, a measurement or detection of consciousness itself.
Now, that isn't to say LLMs don't possess a kind of subjective experience, but that is a whole nother video's worth of topic there.
They say, where's the measuring device? How do we measure consciousness? Well, you're the measuring device. You're talking about it. You've measured it, and it's exerted a force that has affected the chain of events that has led to the muscles in your mouth moving in a certain way. Just because we don't have the math to capture that yet, or the attitude in the scientific community to approach this in a way that acknowledges the obvious, which is consciousness is real, and the definition of real is causality anyway. I mean, when something falls beyond the event horizon of a black hole, it's not considered to exist anymore because it can't exert causal efficacy over
things that have not traversed the event horizon.
Just like if consciousness didn't exist, it wouldn't have causal efficacy over anything around it. So it clearly exists, it's clearly real, and it's clearly measurable too. So there's like an interface between the objective and subjective realms. We need to be putting more effort into figuring out what that looks like. It's going to have huge implications practically for like clinical psychology. Hopefully we can get rid of pharmaceutical-based psychiatry in exchange for something far more targeted and precise, and based in bottom-up reasoning about how we can alter somebody's subjective state, conscious state, in a desirable way.
If you've made it this far, I cannot begin to tell you how much I appreciate your time and attention.
If you thought this video was worth your time, I would very much appreciate a like and a sub.
Thank you so much, and I hope you have a wonderful day.